There is no warning. That's the part that separates hantavirus from almost every other killer on this list. No fever that builds over weeks, no rash you can point to, no moment where your body sends up a flare and says something is wrong. Pay attention, go to the doctor now. What hantavirus gives you instead is a headache, maybe some muscle soreness. The faint, dismissible conviction that you might be coming down with something, that you should probably drink more water and get an early night. And so you do. You go to bed. You sleep. And somewhere in the hours between the person you were when you closed your eyes and the person who wakes up struggling to breathe, the virus finishes what it started. By then, it is almost always too late. Hantavirus kills somewhere between 36 and 50% of the people it infects in its most dangerous form. That number needs to sit for a moment. In the era of modern medicine, of intensive care units and antiviral therapies, and the full arsenal of 21st century hospital infrastructure, 1 in 3 people who contract hantavirus pulmonary syndrome will die from it. Some estimates put that number closer to 1 in 2. There is no vaccine. There is no specific antiviral treatment approved for it. What doctors can offer is support, mechanical ventilation, oxygen, careful fluid management, while the immune system fights a battle it frequently loses. And the thing that makes all of this worse, the thing that makes hantavirus one of the most unsettling pathogens in the modern viral landscape, is where it comes from. Your backyard, your attic, the garden shed you haven't opened since October, the hiking trail you walked last summer, the cabin your family rents every August in the mountains, the pile of firewood stacked against the side of the house, the air itself, in places most of us would describe not as dangerous, but as peaceful, as quiet, as exactly the kind of place you go to get away from everything. Stay with this, because what you're about to hear goes into places the standard public health bulletins don't reach. It goes into the science of how this virus actually destroys a human body, and why that mechanism is so specifically, almost elegantly terrible. It goes into the outbreak that changed everything, the cases that should have prompted a global response and didn't, and the reason that right now, today, in conditions that are spreading across multiple continents, the risk from hantavirus is not shrinking. It's growing, and almost nobody is talking about it. Hantavirus is not new. The genus Hantavirus belongs to the family Hantaviridae, a group of RNA viruses carried primarily by rodents. What is crucial to understand, and this is the detail that tends to get lost in the simplified version, is that the rodents don't get sick. They carry the virus their entire lives, shedding it continuously in their urine, their feces, their saliva, without any apparent ill effect. The virus has evolved over thousands, possibly millions of years alongside its rodent hosts into a state of perfect coexistence. The problem is not the rodent relationship. The problem is what happens when humans enter that relationship uninvited. Different rodent species carry different hantavirus variants. In Asia and Europe, the primary carriers include the striped field mouse, the bank vole, and various species of rats. These variants cause a condition called hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, HFRS, which damages the kidneys and can be serious but has a significantly lower fatality rate than what was discovered in the Americas. Because in the Americas, something different was waiting. The deer mouse, Paramyscus maniculatus. Small, large-eyed, almost absurdly charming in photographs, found across virtually the entire North American continent, from Canada to Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. The deer mouse is one of the most abundant rodents on the continent. It lives in woodlands and grasslands and scrublands. It lives in houses, in barns, in stored grain, in the walls of mountain cabins left empty through the winter. It is, by any measure, an unremarkable animal. And it carries sin nombre virus, the specific hantavirus variant responsible for hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, with an efficiency and a geographic range that make it one of the most quietly significant disease reservoirs in the Western Hemisphere. Sin nombre, the name without a name. It was given this designation because when scientists first isolated the virus in 1993, They named it after the creek near where the outbreak occurred, Muerto Canyon, Canyon of the Dead. But that name was considered too alarming for public communications purposes, and so it was changed to Sin Nombre, literally unnamed, which has always struck me as a strange kind of honesty. The thing is real. It kills people. But we decided not to name it properly. The 1993 outbreak on the Navajo Nation is where modern hantavirus history begins, in the sense that this was the moment the medical establishment in North America was forced to confront what had been there all along. It started in May. A young Navajo man in excellent physical condition, an athlete, by multiple accounts, fit and healthy in his mid-20s, collapsed and died within days of a respiratory illness that nobody could explain. Days later, his fiancée died of the same thing. She had been perfectly healthy. She had attended his funeral. She came home, and within days she was gone too. Local physicians, recognizing that something unusual was happening, contacted the Indian Health Service, which contacted the Centers for Disease Control. The CDC sent a team. What they found was that these were not isolated cases. There were others, young, healthy people, disproportionately young and healthy, which is its own form of medical horror, developing a severe respiratory illness that progressed with terrifying speed. Symptoms began like a bad flu. Within 2 to 5 days, the lungs began to fill with fluid. Patients went into what is clinically described as non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, the lungs drowning in their own liquid, the oxygen exchange failing, the body suffocating from the inside while the heart continued beating. Mechanical ventilators could sometimes sustain patients long enough for the immune response to turn. Often, they could not. Here is the mechanism, and pay close attention, because this is the part that explains why hantavirus does what it does in a way that is unlike almost any other respiratory pathogen. The virus doesn't primarily attack the lung tissue itself. What it attacks is the blood vessels. Specifically, the endothelial cells, the cells lining the interior of capillaries throughout the body, including the dense network of capillaries in the lungs. Hantavirus infects these cells and triggers an immune response so aggressive, so disproportionate to the size of the initial infection, that the capillaries effectively leak. They become permeable. Fluid pours out of the bloodstream into the surrounding tissue. In the lungs, where the capillary network is extraordinarily dense, this produces the characteristic flooding that kills hantavirus patients. The cruel irony, and medicine is full of cruel ironies, but few this pointed, is that it's not the virus killing you directly. It's your own immune system's response to the virus. The body detects the infection and launches a counterattack of such overwhelming force that it destroys the very infrastructure it needs to survive. Immunologists call this a cytokine storm. In hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, it is one of the most rapid and complete examples of this phenomenon in known viral disease. This is why young, healthy patients often fare worse than older ones. A more vigorous immune system generates a more devastating storm. The people who are most physically equipped to fight infection are sometimes the ones most likely to be destroyed by fighting it. Sit with that for a moment before we continue. The CDC investigation in 1993 traced the outbreak to deer mice. Investigators found that the mouse population in the Four Corners region, the area where New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah meet, had exploded dramatically that year. The reason was ecological. A wet winter and spring had produced abundant vegetation, which produced abundant food for rodents, which produced a population boom. More mice meant more virus shed into the environment, more contamination of the spaces where humans lived and worked and breathed. A simple chain of cause and effect, rain, grass, mice, death, that unfolded over months before anyone recognized it. By the time the investigation concluded, 32 people were confirmed infected. Half of them died. The CDC named the new disease Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome and launched a national surveillance program. Researchers began testing rodents across the continent and found what retroactive analysis confirmed. HPS had almost certainly been killing people for years, possibly decades, misdiagnosed as atypical pneumonia or acute respiratory distress syndrome of unknown origin. The 1993 outbreak hadn't introduced a new disease. It had finally given a name to an old one. The surveillance program has now been running for over 30 years. The numbers it has produced are worth understanding in full. Since 1993, the United States has recorded over 900 confirmed cases of Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. The fatality rate has remained consistent, between 35 and 40% across the entire surveillance period. That means somewhere above 300 people, in a country with world-class medical infrastructure, with well-equipped hospitals and trained infectious disease specialists, and every resource that modern medicine can bring to bear, have died from a disease with no specific treatment, contracted by breathing contaminated air in places they had every reason to believe were safe. The cases are geographically concentrated in the western United States: New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, California, Montana, Washington. But they have occurred in nearly every state. No region of North America is without risk, and the cases continue every year, quietly, without the press coverage of a novel coronavirus or the public health mobilization of an influenza pandemic. People get sick, people die, and the numbers update on the CDC website with the steady, unglamorous rhythm of a disease that has become normalized precisely because it cannot be fixed. But here is where the story moves out of the American West and becomes something larger, something that explains why this is not a regional curiosity or a historical footnote. Hantavirus is not contained to North America. It has never been. And in the last 2 decades, the picture of global hantavirus distribution has been expanding and shifting in ways that epidemiologists find genuinely concerning. In South America, particularly in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, local hantavirus variants have produced their own distinct epidemics. The Andes virus, carried by the long-tailed pygmy rice rat in Argentina and Chile, is responsible for an HPS variant that shares most of the clinical characteristics of sin nombre infection: the rapid progression, the pulmonary flooding, the catastrophic immune response, but with one critical additional feature that sin nombre does not possess: person-to-person transmission. Every other hantavirus variant documented so far transmits only from rodent to human. You breathe contaminated air, you touch contaminated surfaces, and then touch your face, and the virus enters your respiratory tract. You cannot get it from another infected person. But the Andes virus, in documented cases going back to a 1996 outbreak in Argentina, has been transmitted between people, primarily between intimate contacts, spouses, caregivers, people sharing enclosed spaces for extended periods. The transmission efficiency is low, but it exists. This matters enormously, and here is why. The barrier between a rodent-borne virus with a 35% case fatality rate and an airborne human transmissible virus with a 35% case fatality rate is not a barrier of magnitude. It is a barrier of mechanism. If the Andes virus or any hantavirus variant were to acquire more efficient human-to-human transmission through mutation or reassortment, the resulting pathogen would be among the most dangerous ever encountered by medical science. Not because it would be unprecedented in its lethality. Ebola, untreated, kills more people proportionally, but because of the combination of features it would carry. Airborne, slow initial symptom progression, a multi-day window during which infected individuals feel only mildly unwell and continue normal activity. Fatality rate approaching 50%, no vaccine, no specific treatment. Virologists and pandemic preparedness specialists have discussed this scenario in academic literature. It does not receive the coverage that, by any rational measure of risk, it deserves. The Yosemite outbreak of 2012 is perhaps the most resonant American case study for understanding how hantavirus enters the lives of ordinary people in circumstances of absolute normalcy. Yosemite National Park. One of the most visited natural sites in the United States, 3.5 million visitors per year, iconic landscape, Half Dome, El Capitan, the valley floor, families, hikers, honeymooners, retirees, school groups. The park's Curry Village offered tent cabin accommodations, fabric-walled structures elevated on platforms set among pine trees. Exactly the kind of accommodation that suggests adventure and proximity to nature without requiring full camping equipment. The kind of place parents bring children, the kind of place people return to repeatedly across the years of their lives. Deer mice had been nesting in the insulation of those tent cabins. The insulation was double-walled, creating a cavity that was warm, enclosed, and apparently ideal for rodent habitation. Guests were sleeping 8 feet from active deer mouse colonies without knowing it. When the insulation was disturbed, by animals moving, by maintenance work, by the ordinary compression and settling of a structure in use, dried rodent excretions became airborne inside the sleeping spaces. 3 people died. 10 were confirmed infected. The park sent letters to everyone who had stayed in the affected cabins over the previous summer. Approximately 230,000 letters, because that was the potential exposure window. 250,000 people who had gone on vacation, slept in what looked like a safe and regulated facility, breathed air inside those cabins, and then gone home without knowing what they might have inhaled. The park closed the Curry Village tent cabins. The investigation found that hantavirus infection had likely been occurring at that site intermittently for years before the 2012 cluster was identified. The point is not that Yosemite is uniquely dangerous. The point is the opposite. Yosemite is one of the most inspected, most managed, most visited national parks in America, and deer mice were nesting undetected in guest accommodations for what appears to have been an extended period. If it can happen there, it can happen in any rural cabin, any barn, any vacation property that sits empty through the winter months and is opened again in spring. The conditions under which hantavirus risk is elevated are precise and worth knowing. Rodent populations boom in years with high precipitation and abundant food. The ecological pattern that preceded the 1993 outbreak repeats on irregular cycles across the affected regions. Disturbing enclosed spaces that have been inhabited by rodents, sweeping, vacuuming, moving old boxes in a storage room, creates aerosols from dried excretions. The virus can remain viable in dried rodent urine and feces for several days at normal temperatures. Opening a cabin that has been closed for months in an area where deer mice are present and beginning to clean without respiratory protection is one of the highest risk activities associated with hantavirus infection. Many of the documented cases describe exactly this scenario. There is a specific and recurring tragedy in the HPS case records. Person opens summer cabin at the start of the season. Person sweeps out the evidence of winter, the droppings, the nesting material, the accumulated debris. Person feels vaguely unwell over the following days. Person assumes a mild cold or minor flu. Person's symptoms rapidly worsen. Person is admitted to hospital in respiratory distress. In the hours or days that follow, the clinical picture clarifies. By then, the treatment window, such as it is, which is essentially supportive care, may already be closing. One specific case, documented and publicly discussed by the patient's family, involves a man in his late 30s, outdoorsman, experienced, someone who would not be described by anyone who knew him as careless or unfamiliar with rural environments, who spent a weekend cleaning out a storage structure on a family property in the southwestern United States. He wore gloves. He did not wear a mask. Within a week, he was on a ventilator. Within 2 weeks, he was dead. His family agreed to speak about his case publicly, specifically, because they wanted people to understand that this is not a disease that selects for the ignorant or the reckless. It is a disease that selects for proximity and circumstance. The international data continue to accumulate. In Europe, the Pumala virus carried by bank voles causes regular outbreaks of HFRS across Scandinavia, Germany, Belgium, France, and Russia. Finland reports significant case spikes in years when the vole population peaks. In 2017, Germany recorded over 1,700 HFRS cases in a single year, a figure that passed largely unnoticed in international health coverage, despite representing a substantial cluster of a disease with genuine fatality risk. In Asia, hantavirus has been endemic for decades. South Korea has documented cases consistently. China has reported significant HFRS burden, particularly in rural provinces. The Hantavirus, the original hantavirus isolated and identified in the 1970s from infected Korean War veterans who had developed mysterious hemorrhagic fever, remains circulating in East Asia. Over 100,000 HFRS cases are estimated to occur globally each year. The majority are in Asia. The majority receive minimal international attention. The COVID-19 pandemic introduced the concept of zoonotic spillover, viruses jumping from animal reservoirs to human populations, to a global audience that had previously found the concept abstract. Hantavirus is a decades-old lesson in the same phenomenon. It is not a future risk or a theoretical scenario. It is a present, ongoing, repeatedly fatal demonstration of what happens when human activity intersects with established animal disease reservoirs in the wrong way. And the trajectory of that intersection is moving in one direction. Deforestation pushes human settlement into previously wild habitat. Climate variability drives the rodent population booms that precede human outbreaks. Urban expansion creates more interfaces between human structures and the rodents that have learned to exploit them. Global warming is shifting the range of deer mice and other carrier species northward and into higher elevations. The geography of hantavirus risk is not static. It is expanding incrementally in the direction of more people. The question of why hantavirus does not receive the public health attention its fatality rate would seem to demand is worth examining directly. Several factors converge. The case numbers, while devastating for the individuals involved, are relatively low in absolute terms, a few hundred per year in North America, which compares unfavorably in headline terms to influenza or COVID-19. The disease is non-transmissible person to person in its primary forms, which means it doesn't trigger the exponential outbreak dynamics that drive pandemic response systems. It disproportionately affects rural populations who receive less consistent public health infrastructure and less consistent media coverage than urban centers. And there is no pharmaceutical industry incentive of scale. The market for a hantavirus vaccine, while real, is not large enough to have driven the investment that flu vaccines or COVID vaccines commanded. The result is a disease that kills reliably year after year, that has no cure and no vaccine, that is spreading in its geographic range, that in its South American form has demonstrated person-to-person transmission, and that public health communications address primarily through advice to wear a mask when cleaning out your shed, which is not wrong advice. It is genuinely, concretely important advice. Wear a mask, wet down surfaces before sweeping, spraying a mixture of bleach and water on rodent-contaminated areas before disturbing them dramatically reduces aerosol generation. Ventilate enclosed spaces before entering them. Use gloves, trap and seal entry points. These measures work. They save lives. The gap between what we know and what most people do with that knowledge is where most of the preventable deaths occur. But the advice treats hantavirus as a maintenance problem, a matter of personal hygiene and cabin management, rather than as what it actually is. A persistent, incurable, expanding zoonotic disease with one of the highest case fatality rates in the viral world, operating in environments that billions of people interact with regularly, with no pharmaceutical solution on the near horizon and no global surveillance system adequate to its actual reach. The people who died of hantavirus this year, and people did, the cases are documented, the families exist, did not die of negligence or ignorance in most cases. They died of a disease that medicine has not yet found a way to stop. They died quickly, in many cases, in the window between the first symptoms that felt dismissible and the respiratory crisis that was not. They died in ICUs, where doctors and nurses did everything available to them, which was not enough, because enough does not yet exist. There is a researcher at the University of New Mexico named Dr. Brian Hjella, who has spent decades studying hantavirus. He was part of the initial response to the 1993 outbreak. He has watched the surveillance numbers accumulate over 30 years. In various interviews across his career, he has returned to a version of the same observation. that the case fatality rate of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome would, if it appeared as a novel pathogen today, trigger immediate emergency research funding and global health mobilization. But because it has been here for decades, killing steadily and quietly, it has been absorbed into the background radiation of accepted medical reality. Accepted medical reality. The phrase sounds clinical. What it means in practice is that we have decided, without quite saying so, that a certain number of people dying each year from a disease we cannot treat is a tolerable situation. That the problem is not large enough, or visible enough, or urban enough to move to the front of the queue, that it can wait while other priorities are addressed. The people in the case files did not have the option of waiting. There was a family in Montana. Their name has been kept out of the public record at their request, but their story was shared with researchers who published it in aggregate, who went to their summer property at the beginning of June. They had been going to this property for 15 years. The father knew the land, knew the buildings, knew the signs of winter animal activity to look for and deal with before the season began. He found evidence of mice in the storage shed. He cleaned it. He did not use a mask. He hadn't in previous years, and nothing had happened. 5 days later, he was in hospital. 12 days after that, he died. He was 51 years old. His daughter, who had been with him on the trip and had helped with the cleaning, tested negative. She has spoken publicly about living in the knowledge that her own immune system's particular response to the same exposure had saved her while her father's had not. There is no framework adequate to that kind of arbitrary devastation. There is only the fact of it, and what we do with the fact. What we can do, what the evidence supports, is take the precautions seriously. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what this disease actually is, rather than the minor footnote it's typically presented as. When you open a space that rodents have occupied, treat it as a potential contamination site. Wet the surfaces. Wear a proper mask, not a cloth mask, not a surgical mask for this purpose, but an N95 rated respirator. Ventilate before you enter. These steps take minutes. They cost almost nothing. And based on everything the epidemiological record shows us, they work. Know the symptoms. The initial presentation of HPS looks like flu, fever, muscle aches, fatigue, sometimes nausea and vomiting. This phase lasts 4 to 10 days. Then, in the cases that go on to develop pulmonary syndrome, comes the respiratory phase: cough, shortness of breath, a feeling of tightness or pressure in the chest. This phase can progress to respiratory failure within hours. If you have been in an environment with potential rodent contamination and you develop these symptoms, tell your doctor. Those 3 words, potential rodent exposure, change the entire clinical calculation. A physician who knows to look for hantavirus can initiate supportive care earlier and with more specific focus. Earlier intervention saves lives, not all lives, but some. Some is not nothing. And perhaps most importantly, take seriously the conversation that hantavirus forces us to have about zoonotic disease more broadly. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated, at global scale, what a zoonotic pathogen can do when it acquires the right combination of transmissibility and severity. Hantavirus, in its current forms, lacks efficient human-to-human transmission. But it doesn't lack lethality, and it doesn't lack reach, and it doesn't lack the demonstrated capacity for evolutionary change. The Andes virus variant exists as proof that person-to-person transmission is within the biological repertoire of this virus family. What prevents the next variant from improving on it is not any active human intervention. It is chance, the arbitrary lottery of mutation. That is a thin line between the current situation and something considerably worse, thinner than most people are aware of, thinner than the coverage would suggest. When scientists talk about the pathogens they consider most concerning from a pandemic preparedness standpoint, the viruses on what some researchers informally call the worry list, hantavirus variants, particularly Andes, consistently appear. They appear not because they are currently causing mass casualties, but because the combination of features they carry, considered together, places them in a category of risk that demands more attention than they receive. You breathe it in. You don't know you have it. Then your lungs collapse. That sequence, from ordinary breath to catastrophic organ failure, happens in days. It leaves almost no room for intervention. It has happened to people who were doing nothing more dangerous than cleaning a room, opening a window, taking a walk through a field at the wrong moment in the wrong season. It will happen again. It happens every year. And when it does, the people it happens to discover, in the most intimate possible way, that there are still things in this world that medicine cannot fix. The distance between you and Hantavirus is not measured in geography or in risk categories. It's measured in the space between a deer mouse and an air duct, between a dusty floorboard and a human lung, between a weekend trip to a mountain cabin and a call to a family member who will not be coming home. If this story made you feel the weight of something you didn't expect to feel today, that's the point. Share it with someone who spends time outdoors, who has a rural property, who goes hiking, who has never heard this virus's name. Subscribe, because the things worth knowing are rarely the things trending. And remember this, the most dangerous threats are almost never the loudest ones. They're the quiet ones, the unnamed ones, the ones moving through the air while you sleep, the ones that don't announce themselves until there is nothing left to announce.